Good evening, my friends. I'm Stephen Goldman, Executive Director of the Holocaust Memorial Center, Zeckelman Family Campus. I want to welcome you to this program tonight. Before we begin, before we do anything, I think it would be well and good to reflect for a moment on the life of a true 20th century hero who passed away today, Nelson Mandela, who has been a hero to many, a savior to many, and just a good guy. His life is an example, I think, for all of us. His bravery, his self-sacrifice, and his righteousness in the face of adversity. So welcome to the Emancipation and Abolition, the Transatlantic Search for Freedom. So now it gives me great pleasure to present actually a fairly new friend, Howard Lupovitch. He's the director of the Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State. He's a renowned scholar, and he speaks okay, I guess. No, he's a very nice man. I've heard him before, and it's a pleasure to welcome him here tonight, and I certainly hope you enjoy his talk. Howard?
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First things first, can everybody hear me? You can hear me in the back? That's very important. First, I should say, I'm too young to remember any of that civil rights stuff, so, I take your word for it. But I do have a particular memory of Nelson Mandela. When I graduated from the University of Michigan, he was one of the individuals given an honorary degree that year, but he was supposed to be given an honorary degree, I should say, but since he was still in prison, since he couldn't be there to accept it in person, according to the bylaws of the university, they couldn't give it to him. And so while the regular graduation was going on at the stadium, there was a counter-graduation going on at the Diag, basically protesting, the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela, but also protesting the university for not giving him a degree. And even for those of us who were at the regular graduation in the stadium, most of us had Mandela stickers on our caps and gowns. By coincidence, or maybe not by coincidence, the graduation speaker was Javier Pérez de Cuellar, then the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I don't think he got through more than 2 or 3 sentences at a time with hundreds of students yelling, "Mandela, Mandela." So it was an exciting moment, So for those of us who are a little bit younger, that was a little taste of social protest, defying the establishment, even the Secretary General of the United Nations. So it is a great loss. Now, this evening, the topic I'm going to speak about this evening, I want to begin by saying something obvious. Well, maybe obvious to some of you, but that it is appropriate, I would say, to have a lecture about Jewish abolitionists, Jews opposing slavery in America, here at the Holocaust Memorial Center. Now, maybe I'm going to say it anyway, because I think it might be, but here's why I think. There's an interesting parallel. I mean, the Holocaust is one of these dark moments in human history, one of the darkest moments in human history, no question. But amidst all that darkness, amidst that abyss, there are these glimmers of light, heroic acts of resistance, heroic acts of survival, and of course, the acts of righteous Gentiles acting on behalf of Jews. I don't think all of this heroism and these glimmers of light really didn't alter the overall story very much. I mean, there's a Hebrew expression, shoah ugvura, Holocaust and heroism, and both are important, but we have to keep a sense of proportion. But even if they didn't alter the story very much, they still are remarkably important, and we remember those glimmers of light. We have to, because it's an important part of the story. Similarly, slavery in the United States, this might be the singular darkest moment in American history. Not only the enslavement of a huge population, but also the fact that after slavery ended legally, for a century thereafter, the prejudice and racism which animated it just persisted, and in some sense continues to persist. This is a very dark chapter in American history, but as with the episode of the Holocaust, there are glimmers of light here too. There are individuals who stood up and openly and actively opposed slavery, as we'll see in one case tonight, even putting their lives in jeopardy in some cases. Now, they also didn't really alter the large story. Slavery, despite these heroic acts of resistance to slavery and opposition to slavery, the overall story is still there, but they're still noteworthy nonetheless, and I think they're worth mentioning. And that's why I think it's appropriate to speak on this subject here. Now, let me give you the short version of what I'm going to say, and then I'll give you the long version. The short version is that in the mid-19th century, there were a number of Jews who were born in Central Europe or in Eastern Europe, experienced discrimination as second-class citizens there, and while there, in one way or the other, fought for the amelioration, for the improvement of the condition of Jews and for Jewish emancipation, and then at some point crossed the Atlantic, came to America, and fought against slavery, fought for the emancipation of the American slaves. That, in a nutshell, is the short version. And these are the four major Jewish abolitionists. They're not the only ones. There were others as well, but I think these are what we might call the big four. Before I go on, also, I would point out that there are four individuals here. In some ways, they have things in common, as we'll see. They also, in some ways, they're very different from each other. And we've got David Einhorn as the only rabbi. We've got one rabbi and three lay people. Ernestine Rose is the only woman. Michael Mihai Halpern is the only Hungarian. The others were born in some sort of German-speaking part of Central Europe. So they're different in certain ways, but they also have certain things in common. Their story is an interesting one. It's also an indicative one. So let me turn to this story. A little bit of backstory first. To really understand what they did and the significance of what they did, you have to have two pieces of backstory. First of all, you have to understand the larger world in which they lived, or worlds in which they lived, 19th century America and Central Europe, and you have to understand the larger Jewish worlds in which they lived, 19th century American Jewry and 19th century Central European Jewry. Now, those are very large subjects, so let me give you a couple broad brushstrokes to say a few things about them. First of all, you might think, or one might think, that 19th century America and 19th century Central Europe were very different places. In some ways they were. I mean, think about it. America was the New World. Europe was the Old World. 19th century America was a republic. 19th century Central Europe was ruled by empires. 19th century Central Europe was a class society, hierarchical, with nobility and peasantry and all sorts of social classes. 19th century America, at least theoretically, was a more egalitarian society. But when we look beyond those generalizations, we do see some real similarities. In fact, about 20 years ago, an economic historian whose name is David F. Good, he wrote a book. He wrote an economic history of the Habsburg monarchy. Those of you who don't know, that's what Austria-Hungary was called. Before it was called Austria-Hungary, it was called the Habsburg monarchy. And it was a very dry book in many ways. That's why not many people read it. Economic history, no offense to economists out there, but I mean, come on, it's economics and it's history wed together. But in this, one of the points he makes in this book is he notes some similarities between the Habsburg monarchy in the 19th century and the United States in the 19th century. For example, each was regionally divided in a similar way. The United States had a northern and a southern part, the Habsburg monarchy a western and an eastern part. In the United States, the northern part was more industrialized. The western part of the Habsburg monarchy was more industrialized. The southern part of the United States was more agricultural and rural. The eastern part of the Habsburg monarchy was more agricultural and rural. Slavery/serfdom had largely disappeared in the northern part of the United States and in the western part of the Habsburg monarchy. by the mid-19th century, in the eastern part of the Habsburg monarchy and the southern part of the United States, there was slavery, there was serfdom. Now, I've used these terms side by side, slavery and serfdom. I have to make sure we understand the differences and similarities between these terms too, because it's also very important in understanding the transatlantic experience of these Jewish abolitionists. In a legal sense, I would say that serfdom and slavery are not the same, because serfs theoretically enjoy certain rights. They do enjoy certain rights. They have obligations, they have restrictions, but theoretically they had rights. Slaves had no rights. But beyond that legal difference, in fact, like slaves, the serfs lived and died by the whim of their lords, in the same way that slaves lived and died by the whims of their masters. And you could have a landlord who was kinder and a landlord who was crueler, in the same way you could have a master who was kinder and one who was crueler. But their lives were very similar. The one I think significant difference is, oftentimes American slaves had the traumatic experience of families being torn apart. That happened less often with serfs, because if anything, serfs were given no mobility. They were never allowed to leave their own village or their own farm community, which was difficult in many ways, but it meant that generations of the same family, they lived together. There was no way, they weren't going to be separated, because none of them were ever allowed to move anywhere. But for the most part, these are very similar situations. The other difference, the other similarity between the 19th century, the United States, and the Habsburg monarchy, of course, is that each had a moment when these two very different regions fought each other. One side fighting to preserve the Union, the other side fighting to secede. So in 1848, the eastern part of the Habsburg monarchy, the Hungarian part, fought what the Hungarians like to call the War of Independence. Others called it the Revolution, or the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, where the Austrians and the emperor fought to keep the empire together. Just like in the United States 20 years later, one part of the United States was fighting for independence, the other side was fighting for the Union. One other similarity, and that was the 19th century notion of liberalism. Now, the way liberalism was used in the 19th century was different than the way liberalism is used today. And the most important difference is, in the 19th century, to be liberal did not mean to be democratic. In fact, most liberals were anti-democratic. Liberals believed that the educated and the propertied elements of society had a responsibility to make everyone else's life better. They also believed that hereditary privilege should disappear, so you shouldn't have any more nobles or guilds or special rights for the church. That should disappear. But by the same token, they didn't believe that every single person should have a vote. Not even that every man should have a vote. Not even that every white man should have a vote. They believed the only people responsible enough to be entrusted with the right of voting was an individual, was a man who was educated and had enough property to have some sort of moderation and balance. 19th century liberals believed that universal suffrage was the road to demagoguery and tyranny, because the masses, the unwashed, educated masses, were simply too easy to manipulate by demagogues. And so they were anti-democratic. Rather, they believed it was their responsibility to improve the lot of the lower classes. And if you think that's a little patronizing and condescending and paternalistic, it was. They believed that they, the educated, with the property, were the best suited to make society better. And this was true both in the United States in the 19th century, in the North and the South, and in the Habsburg monarchy. So they were similar in certain ways. Jews who lived in these societies were coming from similar contexts. Now, of course, there was one important difference for Jews. Jews who lived in the Habsburg monarchy and in Central Europe in general were second-class citizens until the end of the 1860s. In the Habsburg monarchy, Jews were emancipated in 1868, and in Germany they were emancipated in 1871, whereas in the United States, Jews never really needed to be emancipated. Jews became full citizens because of the First Amendment to the Constitution. And even though there was occasional discrimination and disabilities against Jews, it was very different. It was a preferred place to be for Jews, no question about it. That's one of the reasons why many Jews left Central Europe during the 19th century and came to America. So what can we say? What can we generalize about what it meant to be a Jew in Central Europe versus what it meant to be a Jew in the United States? Well, in the United States, American Jewry during the 19th century grew very quickly. Listen to the difference between these numbers. In 1820, which in American Jewish history is the end of the colonial period, or the period of the early republic, there were about 3,000 Jews in America, most of whom lived on the eastern seaboard, mostly in a few communities, Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, Savannah. And most of them were well on their way to, well, doing what Jews in America have generally done ever since, becoming American. That's 1820. In 1880, there were nearly 300,000 Jews in America. There was a massive influx of Jews after 1820, predominantly from Central Europe. And so the presence of Jews in America, while though still a minority, a small minority in 1880, was far more significant than in 1820. Now, most of the Jews who came to America were coming for economic reasons. They were looking for a better life. They were looking for new opportunities. Some had political ideas. Mostly, they were just looking for a chance to, a better quality of life. And most of the Jews who came, when they arrived, they were what we call petty merchants, peddlers and hawkers, and someone with a pushcart maybe. And within a generation or two, a few rose to great success. There was a Jewish peddler who came to America during the mid-19th century. He eventually went west, and he discovered that a lot of the settlers out west needed a new kind of pants that was very durable. Of course, his name was Levi Strauss. Gimbel's department store is another example. But for most Jews, the typical story in 19th century America is arriving as a peddler and becoming a shopkeeper, maybe owning a cigar store or something like that. So there was this economic upward mobility. But these Jews, during the course of a couple of generations, they did become highly Americanized. Now, what that meant is not as simple as it might sound. I often like to ask my students when I teach them about Jews in the Civil War. I say, do you think American Jews during the Civil War were pro-slavery or anti-slavery? And naturally, most of the students go, oh, of course, they were pro-slavery because, that whole prophetic tradition of ethics and whatever. And I often remind them, and I can remind you too, because about 4 minutes ago I said, what Jews do in America more than anything else is become American. So when you ask the question, were Jews pro or anti-slavery in America, you have to make it part of the larger question. Were Americans pro or anti-slavery? And of course the answer is, well, some were pro and some were anti. And similarly with Jews who lived in the American South tended to be pro-slavery. They were immersed in Southern society. Jews who tended to live in the North tended to be anti-slavery. Most, though, either they tolerated slavery in the South or they ignored slavery in the North. I mean, that was a typical American approach. Slavery was either something very natural to you if you lived in the South, or it was something, that happened someplace else if you lived in the North. Now, in Central Europe, the situation for Jews in the mid-19th century was tougher than in America, I mean, for the simple reason that there was a public debate during the mid-19th century in Central Europe over whether or not Jews were worthy of citizenship. Now, here's the thing. It is one thing to always be a second-class citizen, but there were some Jews in Central Europe, those Jews who lived in the German states, who were emancipated briefly under Napoleon for about 10 years. They tasted citizenship briefly, and after that, they were disenfranchised. Now that's different, or I would say that's more difficult. Being disenfranchised is more difficult. It's a more difficult situation to bear than never having been emancipated. I always think of, for a long, I haven't flown first class that many times in my life. I usually fly coach. And I'm always fine with flying coach until the first time I sat in first class, the big seat, the cloth napkin, the flight attendants I think they're a little nicer up there. I don't know if that's my imagination or not. And wow, I couldn't believe it, which was all in well. And then I went back to coach, and I had never noticed it's crowded, and the food is not that good. It comes from these containers. I never noticed it before till I had to come back from first class. Jews in Central Europe, many of them experienced that loss of citizenship. And for many of them, for some of them, it set them down an increasingly radical political road. They were more and more self-conscious and aware of the disabilities and discrimination that they and their fellow Jews faced. And that's a big difference. Jews who had never been emancipated, they didn't notice it as much because they and their forebears had a certain situation for a long time. So it's the Jews who come from Central Europe, not surprisingly, who become the most attuned to trying to change the world and trying to improve the condition of Jews. And they're the ones who begin to lobby beginning in the 1840s. They join the active political movement lobbying for Jewish emancipation in the various states of Central Europe. Now, I have to make another distinction. Because we use the term emancipation to talk about Jews becoming citizens in Europe, and we use the term emancipation to talk about the liberation of the American slaves. Those two things were not exactly the same. In fact, using the term Jewish emancipation, or using emancipation with respect to the Jewish situation, is a bit of a misnomer for the following reason. The word emancipation comes from a Latin phrase. There's a Latin phrase, manu capere. Manu is like the French or the Spanish word for hands. Manu capere means to grab or to seize. It's like the word capture, or it's like the Yiddish or German word chap. So manu capere means to seize with one's hands. Now, in the Roman world, where the Latin language, of course, came of age, manu capere, to seize with one's hands, that was the expression used to show ownership or authority over something. So if you took possession of something, the way you showed possession was by placing your hands on it and seizing it with your hands. So mancipium or mancipio means to take ownership of something. Now, to release something or someone from this position of being owned by someone else is ex mancipio, or in Latin it abbreviates to emancipio. The word emancipation, in other words, means being released from slavery, going to freedom. Now that's an apropos with respect to the slaves in the United States, but not exactly for Jews, because Jews had never been slaves. Prior to Nazi Germany, there was no situation maybe since ancient times, I want to say maybe since the biblical story of Egypt, where Jews were enslaved. Wherever Jews lived, they always had rights and obligations. And generally speaking, they had more rights than their serf neighbors. I'll give you one example. If you remember the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson, I know, before Mel Gibson went crazy, and we could easily talk about Mel Gibson. I miss that Mel Gibson sometimes. Now, he's ruined for me now. Martin Riggs is just gone. You can't talk about him anymore. In any case, Braveheart is the story of William Wallace. William Wallace was a Scottish commoner who he marries in secret because he knew that according to the law of the land, Scottish commoners, Scottish peasants, basically, were subject to something called prima noctum. First night, it meant that when a peasant got married, his lord had the right to his wife on the first night. A horrible thing which Jews were never subject to. So I'm not saying the situation of Jews was lovely. At times it was not. But they never had to deal with that horrible situation. So at least in one respect, the rights that Jews enjoyed, the range of rights, was superior to the rights that serfs and peasants enjoyed. In any case, Jewish emancipation did not mean going from slavery to freedom. For Jews, emancipation meant replacing one set of rights and obligations with another set of rights and obligations. And the set of rights and obligations they swapped for was the same rights and obligations everyone else had. Jews were vying to be treated like everyone else. That was the goal of Jewish emancipation. So technically it wasn't slavery, but I suppose metaphorically, symbolically, poetically, politically, it worked. Okay. That, I think, is the background. Let's turn more specifically to a couple of these individuals. I think we're going to look at them one at a time, and we're going to begin with a very fascinating man whose name was August Bondy. Now, August Bondy was very much an example of this sort of transatlantic journey that I mentioned. He was born in a small town in what is today southern Germany. He was born into a family which, like I said, his grandparents remembered a time when Jews had been citizens for about 10 years. His parents grew up around the time when Jews had been disenfranchised, and he was raised in a home where his family were second-class citizens, but were part of that yearning to regain citizenship. Long story short, he himself became politically aware and politically conscious and politically driven. One of the things he writes in his autobiography is this, quote, "Even as a child, I decided to dedicate my life to the ideals of progress and freedom. I never deviated from this decision during the course of my long life, a life rich in stormy events. I have remained faithful to the principles that I swore to uphold during the stormy days of the 1848 revolution." For August Bondy, the turning point of his life as a political activist was 1848. Now, what is this 1848 revolutions he was talking about? 1848 in Central Europe was like 1789 in France. There was a whole series of revolutions that broke out in every major city in Central Europe. Vienna and Pest, which eventually became Budapest, and Frankfurt, and in Munich, and all over the place. In fact, there were so many revolutions that there were some towns, some cities, where there wasn't a revolution that sort of felt left out. There was a notion that, if you're a real city in 1848, you got to have a revolution. And in some cases, the members of the Chamber of Congress went out and sort of set up a barricade themselves, just so they wouldn't, we don't want people thinking we're not having a revolution here. We don't want to be that, remote. What were these revolutionaries fighting for? The same sorts of rights that French revolutionaries were fighting in 1789: liberty and equality, social justice, civil rights, the removal of hereditary privilege, the unequal nature of society, rights for everyone. Now, most of these revolutions, they were successful at first. They achieved these measures. Now, the remarkable thing about almost every single one of these revolutions is at the top of the agenda of almost every revolutionary movement in Central Europe was the emancipation of the Jews. Full citizenship for Jews. The reason being is that Jews were a sort of test case, a gauge. You know the expression, if everyone isn't equal, then no one is truly equal? In this case, it was a sort of corollary. If we can't make Jews equal, then we really don't believe we don't believe in these values enough. And by the way, this was nothing new. In France in 1789, during those revolutionary debates, the same thing. They kept talking about equality, and the question came up, when we say equality for everyone, does that include Jews too? Actually, it wasn't only Jews. It was Jews and actors. Actors was sort of a euphemism for gypsies. So if we really mean equal in 1789 and in 1848, Jews have got to be included. And one of the first things they would do was to emancipate the Jews. For someone like August Bondy, this was a real dramatic moment. He was among those. He eventually made his way to one of the larger of these revolutions in Vienna. Vienna was the capital of the Habsburg monarchy. Vienna was the city in Central Europe. Berlin was still a little bit of a backwoods, Budapest, well, it wasn't even united to Budapest yet. It was still kind of remote and dusty. But Vienna, this was the city of Beethoven and music, and also a culture, and it's where the emperor was. And this was where the most significant of these revolutions were. And Bondi remembers it. In his autobiography, he writes, quote, "We youngsters from the barricades and struggles of the revolutionary movements of Germany, Austria, and Hungary, who had been there, initiated into politics, were eager to grasp the opportunity which would prove our important political influence." Now, he was going to recall that a little bit later. When he wrote his autobiography toward the end of his life, he recalled that the experience of fighting for these general values, but also for Jewish emancipation in 1848, would really animate him once he came to the United States. When he came to the United States, he left. He had to leave. When these revolutions of 1848 were ultimately defeated, when the powers that be were able to sort of gather their armies together and defeat them. Not a single one of them lasted for more than 2 years. Once they were defeated, those who had participated in these revolutions, either they were arrested and hung, or they fled for their lives. And the best place to flee from revolution, especially because in the 1850s, Europe as a whole became very conservative and suspicious of revolutionaries, the best place to flee was the United States. So many of these revolutionaries fled to the United States at the moment, in the 1850s, at the moment when the abolition movement, the anti-slavery movement in America was really beginning to gather steam. And the timing could not have been better, both for the anti-slavery movement and for these revolutionaries, these idealists from Central Europe whose cause there had been defeated. Because make no mistake, when the revolutions were defeated, the Jews were disenfranchised. Those edicts of Jewish emancipation were revoked, and Jews had to wait 20 more years. When they came to America, they had a new cause, a new focal point for their idealism. So let me read you this excerpt from Bondi again, and this time I'll read you the whole thing. He's writing this toward the end of his life. "We youngsters from the barricades, and amidst the struggles of the revolutionary movements in Germany, Austria, and Hungary, who had been there initiated into politics, were eager to grasp the opportunity which would prove our important political influence in our new home, America. It was not sympathy with the Negro slave only. It was antipathy against the degradation of labor and humanity, which made us a solid unit." Now, when he came to America, he was an immigrant. He was not a citizen. He couldn't vote. He couldn't engage fully in public political life, and he felt that too. He goes on to say, "We had no votes, as it required 5 years residence for full citizenship, and only full citizenship could vote at that time, but we could argue, we could talk and discuss. And while some stood aghast at the cheek of the exiled youngsters, the crowds listened and were led to consider, were influenced to vote. Then and there was planted the seed." He found abolition, the anti-slavery movement, to be the natural continuation of what he was doing in Europe. And he wasn't just a man about talk. Eventually, he made his way to Kansas, and he was one of 3 Jewish immigrants who joined John Brown's band of anti-slavery fighters in Kansas. Now, after John Brown's raid, John Brown eventually had to flee. August Bondi stayed there and lived for the rest of his life in Kansas, while it was a territory, and in Kansas-Nebraska territory, and in Kansas as a state, and for the rest of his life, he dedicated himself to ameliorating the conditions of all oppressed people in Kansas. He had interesting things to say about John Brown. Describing John Brown, he wrote, quote, "We were united as a band of brothers by the love and affection toward the man who, with tender words and wise counsel, prepared a handful of young men for the work of laying the foundation of a free commonwealth." Now, at the end of the 1850s, he married, he had a business opportunity in Texas. his wife's father had business connections in Texas, and he thought about moving to Texas, where he probably could have been very successful in, I think he was raising cattle. I don't remember exactly, but some sort of commercial version of, or commercial connection to raising cattle. But he refused to leave Kansas, and he wrote in his diary, quote, he went to Texas for a short time, couldn't take it. Quote, "The screams of the slaves who were whipped every morning woke me up before dawn at 4 a.m. I could have married the most beautiful woman in Texas, but I felt I could not marry a woman who owned slaves because my father's son could not be a slave driver." He made his life choice because he refused. It wasn't just that he insisted on fighting against it. He refused to support it or be a part of it in any way. An idealist throughout his life. A similar sort of story we find with the Hungarian Michael or Mihai Heilprin, who in some ways is twinned with the German-born David Einhorn. Let me say a bit about each one of those in Europe, and then we can bring them, they sort of come to America together at the same time. Heilprin, his is the story of the immigrant, but his immigrant story is a double immigrant story. He was an immigrant twice. He was born in a small town in Galicia. Galicia was the part of Poland that belonged to the Habsburg monarchy, but for much of the 19th century, this is a separate part. This really is sort of the boondocks, the most remote part, the most impoverished part, the part that really wasn't well integrated into the rest of the monarchy economically or politically. It was still dominated by the Polish nobility. It was a decidedly hierarchical society where Jews were second-class citizens. In fact, the status of Jews in Galicia in 1850 was the same as their status when it was still part of Poland in 1650. Very little change there. As a young man, his family moved from this small town in Hungary, in Poland, to another small but growing town in Hungary called Miskolc, which is halfway between Budapest and the Carpathian Mountains or so. All right. Now, when his father is what we call in Hebrew a maskil. A maskil means enlightened Jew. He was a participant in a Jewish cultural movement called Haskalah, which was sort of the Jewish wing of the European Enlightenment, with some romanticism thrown in. It's not exactly like that, but he was an enlightened and progressive person. His father, and father-like son, Michael, also moved in a more progressive direction. The remarkable thing is he got to Hungary in 1843. Within 5 years, he had mastered the language, which to me is just unbelievable. I'm still working on it after way more than 5 years. And in 1848, he opened a bookstore in this town of Miskolc. In the spring of 1848, the revolution of 1848 broke out, and Heilprin immediately enlisted among the ranks of the revolutionaries. Now, he wanted to fight, but he had a health issue and wasn't deemed healthy enough to fight in the active military part of this revolution. And so he became one of the literary voices, or one of the poetic or literary activists in this revolution. He wrote poetry in 1848, which is among some of the most, some very profound and good poetry and good revolutionary poetry. Let me read you one. This is a poem that in Hungarian is called Nemzeti Őrdál, which means the Song of the National Guard. The National Guard is what the Hungarian Revolutionary Army was called. We were slaves. Now we are free citizens. We groaned under a yoke. Now we have shaken it off. Now he's talking both about Jews living as second-class citizens and Hungarians living under the oppression of the Habsburg dynasty. Now we have shaken it off as Hungarians. It is sweet to live, sweeter to die for the fatherland. A powerful poem. He was very much part of that revolutionary movement. He was at the forefront of the campaign for Jewish emancipation, and which succeeded briefly before this revolution ended in the summer of 1849. Jews in Hungary were emancipated for about 2 months, and then it was rescinded. And then he came to America in America. One of the first things he began to do in the early 1850s, he began to publish editorials and essays for the New York Tribune and another newspaper called The World, where he was done talking about Jewish emancipation. Almost immediately, he began to advocate for the abolition of slavery. He became an abolitionist almost immediately. David Einhorn was a similar story. David Einhorn was a Reform rabbi in Central Europe in a number of small communities. He also joined the ranks of the revolution in 1848. He came to Hungary briefly after the revolution in 1851. Felt it was too oppressive, so he also came to America, where he took a pulpit. His pulpit was in Baltimore, Maryland. His pulpit was in the South. Now, as advocates for the abolition of slavery, Heilprin and Einhorn came to the forefront of that public debate in connection with a single episode, a single event. At the beginning of 1861, just a few months before the outbreak of the Civil War, at a point when the outbreak of the Civil War was seeming very inevitable, but supporters of the newly elected and soon to be inaugurated President Lincoln, they joined in Lincoln's desire to preserve the Union at any cost. And among Lincoln's most avowed supporters was a rabbi in New York City, whose name was Morris Raphael. And on January 4th, 1861, this rabbi, at his temple, he delivered a sermon/lecture, probably too long to be a sermon, maybe too short to be a lecture, called The Bible View of Slavery. Now, personally, he was against slavery, but like many others, he was more concerned about the survival of the Union than the issue of the treatment of slaves. And so, in this sermon/lecture, he tried to argue that, according to Jewish tradition, and certainly according to the Hebrew Bible, slavery is permitted. That's the argument. He was trying to show that if you're a believing and practicing Jew, there's no reason why you have to advocate the complete abolition of slavery. All right? Let me read you a little bit of what he wrote, because what he wrote elicited a very powerful response from Heilprin and from Einhorn. So, he wrote, this is a bit of a very long sermon, all right? He asked the question, is slaveholding condemned as a sin in sacred scripture? Good question. Keeping in mind that the American South was full of white clergymen who had asked this question and had repeatedly shown biblical justifications for slavery, and Morris Raphael is going to use some of the same arguments. So he writes, quote, even on that most solemn and most holy occasion, the giving of the Ten Commandments, slaveholding is not only recognized and sanctioned as an integral part of the social structure, when it is commanded that the Sabbath of the Lord is to bring rest to avadecha v'amatecha. The fourth of the Ten Commandments said, you shall rest on the Sabbath, everyone shall rest, including your slave and your maidservant, which Raphael inferred to mean, look, if they're implying that slaves need rest on the Sabbath, isn't this commandment implicitly saying that slavery is okay? And also in the 10th and final commandment, the 10th and final commandment says, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's house, your neighbor's slave, which Raphael took to mean implicitly it's okay. He goes on to say, remember, he lives in New York City. Actually, his congregation was in Brooklyn. Well, he's responding to an abolitionist clergyman in Brooklyn, and he says, I would therefore ask the reverend gentleman of Brooklyn and his compatriots, how dare you, in the face of the sanction and protection afforded to slave property in the Ten Commandments, how dare you denounce slaveholding as a sin? When you remember, he goes on to say, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Job, the men with whom the Almighty conversed, with whose names he emphatically connects his own most holy name, and to whom he vouchsafed to give the character of perfect, upright, fearing and God-fearing. All these men were slaveholders. Does it not strike you that you are guilty of something very, very little short of blasphemy? Now, those are powerful words to say. Not only do you not have to be against slavery, to oppose slavery as an institution, you're defying the Bible and the Ten Commandments. That was the gist of the argument. Fortunately, well, certainly fortunately for this story, that was not the last word. In fact, it elicited responses both from David Einhorn and Heilprin, who were far more sophisticated thinkers and whose knowledge of Jewish tradition was much, much more sophisticated and much, much deeper. Listen to how each responded, okay? They each responded within about a week or two. David Einhorn writes, now he's responding to a particular point that Raphael had made, saying that slavery is mentioned in the Ten Commandments in that verse about coveting. Since the Ten Commandments says you shouldn't cover your neighbor's slave, slavery is accepted. He writes, in order not to lessen this conception of property, that slavery is permitted, only one half of this biblical verse is given. And the preceding sentence, thou shalt not covet the wife of thy neighbor, is omitted. He said, Raphael, you're only quoting one, you're only focusing on one little part of that biblical verse. If you look at the whole verse, it has a very different meaning, because it says, you should also not cover the wife of your neighbor, for by no means, he writes, is the wife considered the mere property of the husband, like the ox and the ass, and thus the manservant and maidservant would, in spite of the companionship instead of being mentioned together with animals, the companionship with animals, still have been able to pass as a tolerable person. The noble, sweet wife would then have protected the Eved against the animal. In other words, Einhorn is saying, your logic is wrong. You can't say because slavery is mentioned it's okay. Slaves may be mentioned next to animals in that commandment, but they're also mentioned next to a person's wife. And no one is going to argue in 1860 that a person's wife is property. So if a person's wife isn't property, well, then you can't simply say that slavery is simply acceptable. Now, Heilprin, his critique was even more scathing and more compelling. Heilprin focused on a couple of other parts, because Raphael had mentioned, among other things, that the curse of Ham, the son of Noah. As you may know, Noah and the ark. The story doesn't end with the flood. If you've ever read the book of Genesis, when Noah comes out of the ark and the flood is over, he plants a vineyard. He turns the grapes into wine, he gets drunk, he begins frolicking in his tent in some way, and his grandson, the son of his son Ham, sees him in this tent and gossips about him, and Noah curses Ham and his descendants, basically saying, Ham, your descendants are cursed, and they're going to be enslaved to the descendants of Shem and the descendants of Japheth, who come to be understood as Europeans and Semites. Okay? Now, at some point, some Bible commentators understood the descendants of Ham to be Africans. So there were some, and there were Christian clergymen throughout the American South who said, of course slavery is natural. This is just Noah's curse of his son Ham. It's perfectly fine. It's perfectly acceptable. It's perfectly natural, and it's perfectly divinely ordained. And in some ways, Raphael echoed that argument to make his case. So, Heilprin takes on that argument and just destroys it. Says, quote, the doom of the descendants of Ham, the Hamites, in the predictions, he's saying, where are you seeing some future legacy here? Where? Ham's fourth son, Canaan, is alone. It isn't all of Ham's descendants who are cursed, only the one son who gossiped about Noah. Where is the slightest authority for the doom of his other sons or his race? Open your book. Where is there a word confirming your absurdities? Noah cursed, But did God curse Ham? History shows it, as you say. Compare Ham, the African race, our Negro. What a strange mixture. Where is the identity? In other words, who says that Africans are the descendants of Ham? That's a fiction. South Carolina and Dahomey, Alabama and Timbuktu have more features of resemblance than the biblical Hamites and the modern-day Negroes. Peaceable, unwarlike, nomadic patriarchs, he goes on to say further, challenging this notion that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were slave owners, migrating from people to people and from land to land with their wives, children, and rocks and a few attendants, mostly in half-settled regions and beyond the borders of other societies in order to escape difficulties, unable to defend the honor here of a wife, there of a child, and robbed here of a well, are represented to have been slave holders. I love this, as the historian in him asks the simple question, if they really were slave owners, given those difficulties, and given that they were nomadic, quote, how did they guard their slaves, wise rabbi, on the grazing places between Haran and the river of Egypt, in the valley of the lower and upper Jordan, in the surroundings of Hebron, Shechem, Sodom, and Gomorrah? Had they concluded anti-fugitive slave treaties with the Hittites and the Amorites and the other peoples of Canaan, with the roving and slave-trading Midianites, or with the strictly law-observing magistrates of Sodom and Gomorrah? In other words, it makes no sense to read the Bible as Abraham being some kind of great plantation owner. He says it makes absolutely no sense. For, he goes on to say, if the rabbi, meaning Rabbi Raphael, proves anything, he proves strange things. He proves that bigamy, polygamy, concubinage, and Semitic, not African slavery, all of these and many other odd things to be protected forever by the sanction of a divine law. If you're going to say that because there are stories of slaves in the Bible, it makes slavery acceptable today, then you have to say that polygamy is acceptable today, and all the other odd behaviors in the Bible that nobody else does. You know, he ultimately, Halpern concludes that simply is no argument. And in this day and age, the Bible simply cannot be read that way by a thinking person. Now, what Halpern is conceding is that a person who wants to justify slavery, who wants to see it as okay, can staple some biblical verses to a preconceived notion. But he's saying, Rabbi Raphael, don't pretend that there's some sort of a priori biblical acceptance or biblical sanction of the institution of slavery. On the contrary, powerful arguments. But it's this search for idealism we see in Halpern and in Bondi and in Einhorn, which originated in Central Europe, brought to America. Now, the last of these examples I'd like to turn to is different in certain ways, and this is Ernestine Rose. She's the only woman of the four, and her story is a bit different in certain ways. It's a bit more complex in certain ways. She, like the others, was born in a small town in Europe. In Europe, she as a woman, she was excluded largely from the revolutionary movement of 1848, and the larger idealistic movement for social justice in Europe was a movement of men largely. But her revolution in Europe in her small town was a personal revolution. Her struggle for equality and liberation was a personal one. She grew up in a small town when she was about 16. She grew up in a traditional town in a traditional home, a home that really wasn't very dysfunctional. Actually, she writes very lovingly about her father and her mother, but when she was about 16, her father betrothed her without consulting her to a man she simply did not love or even like. And he basically said, you are marrying this person. And as was common in those days, he said, you will learn to love him, and this will be good for the family business, and all the usual reasons why arranged marriage took place. And she ran away. She refused. She refused to be forced into a marriage that she did not accept or that she did not suggest. She left her small town in the western part of Poland or the eastern part of Central Europe, and eventually made her way first to Paris and then to London. She was quite an entrepreneur. In London, she was able to invent a cleaning product The sale of the patent, she was able to support herself. She was self-educated, and she became an articulate speaker and quite a charismatic speaker and a pretty good writer as well, which was remarkable for a self-taught woman in those days. But really, her political life really matured when she came to America. When she arrived in America, the middle of the 19th century, she immediately immersed herself, in the anti-slavery movement, but also in the feminist movement. For her, the personal experience, or her experience of what she described as personal bondage, being enslaved by one's father to marry against one's will, which she saw as the end of her life. In her mind, having to live in that marriage was a form of enslavement. Not having that choice, not having the choice of over the most profound decision of her life. And initially in America, she fought against slavery and she fought for the rights of women, and she was good at it. She was a close colleague of Susan B. Anthony and the other initial suffragettes, those fighting for the rights of women. But also, she was also part of the anti-slavery movement as well. Now, for about the first 20 years she was in America, she didn't take very much interest in Jewish issues in America. But toward the end of the 1860s, she was living in Boston, and the editor of the leading Boston newspaper published a series of essays that described Jews in very negative terms. Let me call it that described Judaism in very negative terms. Now, this editor, whose name was Horace Seaver, he said very blithely, very plainly, "I like Jews. I have no trouble with Jews. It's Judaism I don't like. Judaism is primitive. Judaism is irrational. Judaism is particular. All these typical common arguments against Judaism." Now, what he wasn't expecting is that one of his readers, Ernestine Rose, would begin to write letters to his newspaper, basically dismantling his argument point by point. "You say that Judaism has all these problems." She says, "Look, I don't think very much about Judaism. I'm not a practicing Jew, but you're wrong on all counts, inaccurate on all counts." But where she really got him, is where she accused him. Well, at least she claimed that saying that you like Jews but don't like Judaism, you can't do that. You can't pretend not to have these prejudices against individual Jews or Jews as people and say such negative things about Judaism, especially, she added, when what you say about Judaism is so teamed with racial ideas. Judaism has a propensity to be racially exclusive. Judaism has a propensity to be racially discriminatory. She says, "You're not only criticizing Judaism, you're criticizing Jews." And then she goes on to say, the more I read you, because now she's saying, "I really began to pay attention to other things you've written. I found that you are prejudiced. You speak this way not only about Jews, but other minorities as well. And you've never been exposed as someone with racial prejudice against slaves and against African Americans. But now you are, because the things you say about Judaism, you've tried to make that same slippery argument about other groups as well." Now, she didn't succeed in getting Horace Seaver to retract anything. Horace Seaver, first of all, he refused to take her entirely seriously because she was a woman. He also refused to take her entirely seriously because she was a Jew. And he refused to take her entirely seriously because she was too closely associated with the anti-slavery movement, who Horace Seaver regarded as a bunch of crazy radicals. Even after the Civil War was over, Horace Seaver was among those let's call them Boston Brahmin intellectuals who said, slavery came to an end through a military struggle, not through the crazy idealistic ideas of abolitionists. For Ernestine Rose, her struggle, therefore, was threefold. Her idealism wasn't only a struggle in favor of Jews and for the liberation of slaves, but also for the liberation of women as well. But we look back and see these as three separate things. Ernestine Rose saw these as all part of one single struggle, one single idealism, one single aim, the elimination of discrimination, disparity, prejudice, racism, hatred. In her mind, as in the mind of Einhorn and Bondi and Heilprin, you couldn't eliminate prejudice in one place. The only way to eliminate it in one place is to eliminate it wholesale. You couldn't just say, I'll just remove prejudice against me and not worry about that. No, they all believed it had to be removed entirely. If it wasn't removed entirely, it couldn't really be removed anywhere. Now, when we look back at the four of them, we see the careers of the four not only remarkable because of what they did in their own lives, but as the start of something remarkable, of a remarkable path for American Jews. Because when we move forward from the actions of these anti-slavery activists who had their roots in one form of Jewish activism or another, and in the case of Ernestine Rose, in the feminist movement, we see a Jewish mentality going forward into the 20th century, which continues to do the same thing, who read the writings of these individuals and learn from them. In that respect, it's not surprising that there were Jews who were prominent among the founders of the NAACP. It's not surprising that there were Jews who were part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. This is part of a great movement toward a better world participated by Jews along with their fellow idealists. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer some questions. Is that okay to have some questions now? Oh, well, he's got to come and ask you some questions. Go ahead.
Go ahead, ask some questions. Well, wait till I get to you with the microphone.
This one right over there. This one is on.
It's not working. This one's on.
What letter is that?
I don't know. This is number C.
C?
Go turn C on. That'll take care of it. Oh, what are we doing? Yes, ma'am. Stand up and speak loudly.
If you can't hear, I'll repeat the question too.
My question is this. As far as I know, the Old Testament, the principle of slavery was a temporary kind of arrangement. Every 7 years, slaves were to be freed. And there's actually even a section in the Old Testament that talks about a slave who refuses to be freed
Right.
should have their ears punctured. In other words, they should be punished for not being free. In other words, the concept of slavery in the Old Testament is not the same as
Turn it down a little bit. It's too loud. Your feedback.
in the United States, because it was a temporary arrangement. So my question to you is, I'm simply surprised, puzzled, by the fact that these two scholars, including the rabbi that you quoted from
Right.
New York, but these two scholars in particular who were busy contradicting him or questioning, how come they didn't mention it?
Okay, excellent question. There is this notion in the Bible that slaves are to be freed every 7 years. There are two kinds of slaves mentioned in the Bible. There's Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, and Eved Knaani, a Canaanite slave, and their status is different. The story, the situation you're describing, every 7 years, that was only for a Hebrew slave. If you enslaved a fellow Hebrew in the Bible, that was only temporary servitude, which conceivably would come to an end after 7 years unless the Hebrew slave agreed to continue it. The Canaanite slave, that was a different story. Now, where slavery is really driven from the Jewish world isn't in the Bible; it's by the rabbis in the Talmud. But by the time you get to the Talmud, which is 1,000 or more years later, the rabbis are they accept it as a necessary evil of society, but they're insistent that if you have a slave or a servant of any kind, they must be treated in a decent way. For the rabbis, cruelty to slavery, and Morris Raphael, even he agreed, cruelty to slavery, to slaves, was not to be tolerated in any facet in Jewish tradition. So I think the reason they're concerned with that, they don't mention that passage, it's only talking about Hebrew slaves, as opposed to slaves, non-Jewish slaves, or non-Hebrew slaves. Wonderful. Well, Thank you very much.
Thank
It was
you
a-
very
it was
much.
a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Howard.